anyone who would like to just make a few introductory remarks for a few minutes? Why don't you start off then, Jan?
So the topic of the panel was how can fundamental science help society, and since my area of work is existential risks and specifically AI risk among them, there are a few interesting areas where fundamental science is especially qualified to make a difference actually compared to. So the critical observation is that there is a significant difference between killing 7.135 and 7.136 billion people, because the difference is not just 1 million people, the difference is potentially trillions, because you will kill also the future generations with your potential so-called error or terror scenarios, as Martin Rees puts them. That is, technology is either deliberately or accidentally misused. So I think help from fundamental science can help to reduce existential risks in like general existential risks by basically introducing a level of deductive thought that is not really doesn't come naturally to humans. We really suck at thinking about scenarios that have never happened before, and especially like human politics is just completely powerless thinking of like addressing scenarios that have never happened before. So you need a level of deductive thinking that that is also necessary to advance fundamental science. Therefore, people are much more better equipped to think about potentially catastrophic scenarios that we have never encountered before. Now, when it comes to, there are two other areas where fundamental science can help, specifically in AI risk, that is risk from machines that are created by machines, that are created by machines, that are created by machines, etc., etc. As I say, I'm not that worried about human creations, although some of them can be scary. I'm much more worried about machine creations. So one thing where fundamental science can help is, or the second thing then, is to get our fundamental ontology right. There, like at the last conference and also here, there have been some discussions like, would it be a bad news or good news if we hit the bottom in terms of explaining the laws of physics? And in my view, it's like undoubtedly good news, because you need a good ontology to program your machines with that might be more intelligent than you are. Imagine if you were programming a superintelligence, or what becomes superintelligence using ontology that's based on 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire. You would basically end up with machines that act completely randomly, and you don't want them to act randomly because there are so many, there are just way more ways to screw up things than to get things right, let's put it that way. And the final thing where fundamental science can help is to, if the laws of physics are fundamental in a way that even superintelligences cannot overcome them, reasoning about fundamental laws of physics and mathematics provides a way how to reason about agents that are more smart than you are, because if fundamental laws of physics are the constraints that we share, then we can also at least build a model that is constrained by laws of physics. Therefore, we can actually. There are a lot of people, especially AI developers, who say that look, this thing is going to be smarter than us. Therefore, there is no way. It's a waste of time trying to build a model of what this thing is going to do. I don't agree with that. I think it's if you have fundamental mathematical and fundamental tools for mathematics and physics, you definitely can and you should reason about what's going to happen, even if there are like agents that are smarter than us inhabiting the planet. Right, so that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, John. Would anyone else want to make any short introductory remarks?
I'll make a remark. So, I think that science is great, and we ought to continue to fund it and so forth. But I think we have a deeper problem when it comes to existential risks, and it's sort of an organizational problem. In fact, I think a lot of the technology in science, maybe all of it, to avoid the immediate existential risks is right here already. But we don't use it. And so you ask why we don't use it. And I think it boils down to the fact that humanity in general has no way of setting long-term objectives. Even as individuals, we don't really have long-term objectives. If I were to ask, I've asked a number of these, all the smartest people I can find, what long-term objectives are. When you get out to 1,000 years, 10,000 years, we have no way of setting objectives that are longer than the lifetimes of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. That's how we evolved, after all, and that's how we think. And to say that we want to work today for objectives that are 10,000 years out it's unnatural. And even as individuals, we have that problem, and as a group, it's exponentially worse. We can't align our objectives even if we have them. So I think that's a fundamental problem. And indeed, if there are issues, risks that take a long time to solve, well, you can't solve those unless you set objectives that are long-term. And I believe there are risks that are long-term and take a long time to solve. I think that's the fundamental problem. Frankly, if we just use the science and technology that we already have, we could probably solve the problems that we currently see. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. Before we do more introductory remarks, just focus things a little bit. What I think would be very helpful is if I can go through each of you 5 here, and each of you just list. You don't have to explain what they are, just in one word or a few words. Which existential risks you're most worried about, in that order. So, what would you say, for example, Melanie? If an existential risk being a risk which could either wipe out and make all humanity go extinct, or destroy basically humanity or our civilization as we know it. What are you most worried about?
So I think probably the indeliberate risks are more dangerous than the deliberate, and probably in the vein of our new creations with biotechnology and synthetic biology, something getting out of hand there would be most potentially risky.
Okay, and Jan?
Well, I actually think that it's a bit of a wrong question. Because if you're worried about, if you want to maximize the average outcome in the future, you should focus your work in area where there's both like negative outcomes. You can avoid negative outcomes and bring about positive outcomes. And therefore, like even if I'm like a little bit ambivalent about what existential risk I'm mostly worried about, I definitely focus on AI risk because
it's unfriendly artificial intelligence.
Yes, because that's the only kind of risk or area that has the positive sides as well.
Right.
Like if you like.
Just to clarify, I wasn't. You're interpreting the question as much more subtle than I intended it. I was just thinking, since you 5 have thought a lot more about existential risk, I think, than most people on this planet, and probably even than most people in the room. It's probably helpful for the discussion to just get a few things listed, so it's not so abstract what we're talking about. So
AI risk, highest impact.
Artificial intelligence gone really wrong. What would you say, Michael?
I think I would focus on badly structured incentives, and in particular incentive structures that push people towards a lack of self-awareness and awareness of motivation. So there are a lot of the actual most likely mechanism whereby humanity gets wiped out in the next century, or really at any point in the future, appears to me to be badly designed or unthoughtfully designed artificial intelligence. But one thing that all of the mechanisms whereby we might be wiped out have in common is that this is happening despite the people who are bringing these mechanisms about not wanting the outcome. and
Yep.
also despite the outcome being a fairly predictable result of their actions that they could have avoided if they basically adhered to rules of reasoning and rules of decision making that they probably knew when they were 10. So the basic problem I could summarize as we have mad scientists, both mad in the sense of angry and mad in the sense of insane. And we have them because we're doing a bad job at creating social structures that create sane, highly capable people. Most people aren't that dangerous, even potentially, because they don't really have very big picture ambitions and aren't doing very novel things. But if people are doing somewhat novel things and are somewhat ambitious, and the social pressures and cognitive pressures around them tend to distort their behavior when they do so, by the time they get to doing really ambitious, really novel things, these pressures may have distorted their behavior into wildly non-rational, non-altruistic and non-selfish behaviors. Like,
Good, Michael, thank you so much. I just let's come back to the questions of why and what we can do about it, because I want to spend a lot of time discussing this here. But let's first just go through and quickly just try to in 10, 20 seconds, which risk are you most concerned about actually doing the physical destruction of us? So biotech gone bad, artificial AI gone bad. What would you say?
Well, if I were
You can say more than one as well if you want.
If I were to answer it in a conventional sense, I'd have to say biodiversity loss is the biggest risk.
Okay.
And it risks maybe not total extinction, but it risks creating a world that won't be fun to live in.
In a world that's very much more fragile, I guess, and
But
vulnerable.
I do want to say that I think when you talk about existential risk and you talk about the extinction of humanity, you're being narrow-minded. I think the real existential risk is wiping out the ability to think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm not afraid of AI, because I think that actually preserves our ability to think in the long term.
Unless, as you heard from Julie Tonoli, it's purely a feed-forward network. Isn't conscious at all. Yeah, good. What would you say?
I think there are two risks. There's an existential risk to science, actually, but maybe I can amplify that.
But let's save the amplification. I just want, because we really have
So
wonderful
my
things to discuss here.
existential risk would be if you take if you say that technology is the ability to do more with less, then according to psychologists, roughly 2 to 3% of the planet are psychopaths. So let's say that's 100 to 200 million lunatics out there. So those lunatics now have the ability, either through software crashing a country's electricity grid, or through dirty bombs, of killing millions of people. I mean, if you look at the classic example, 9/11, it wasn't technologically very sophisticated, but it had a dramatic impact. So I think, humans always imagine there's a risk somewhere else, it's a robot or whatever, or it's an awful animal. And we kind of project our paranoia onto that. But I think usually the biggest danger is ourselves, so that's what worries me.
Oh, good. Since I'm standing here, I'll add one more worry that none of you listed here also. I think I would put personally unfriendly artificial intelligence as number one, but I would put accidental nuclear war as my number two. Is there anyone else in the audience who would want to add something that keeps you awake at night? Say it in 3 words or less, okay? No, let's keep the explanations for later. Yes, Christoph.
Not accidental, but triggered nuclear war. We have increasing number of nuclear aircraft, including North Korea, Pakistan, which is almost unstable. We're probably going to get Iran in the next year. That will mean Saudi will do so. There's an increasing probability the threat is not a hypothetical event, but
a deliberate nuclear war.
Of a giga. The other one, the obvious one that nobody's mentioned, is global warming and a generalized environmental meltdown. And we tend to be sort of self-gazing at computers because that's what we do. We love computers, but there are these risks out there that everybody acknowledges that strangely not a single one of you has mentioned. Environmental catastrophe.
I'm glad you brought that up also, because we all know that we live in a complex, interconnected world, and many wars have been started because of some environmental cataclysm that led to lack of resources, etc., right? And if you have biodiversity disappearing, you suddenly have a very robust ecosystem and turn it into a very fragile one. So now if something else happens, it could be a much bigger catastrophe. Does anyone else want to say in 3 words or less something to just add to the list no one has said before? Yes.
Water scarcity.
Water scarcity, yeah. Adrian?
Mechanization and dehumanization of humans.
Yeah. Mechanization and dehumanization of humans, yeah.
Disease.
Disease. So in other words, as opposed to biotechnology gone bad, maybe deliberately creating or accidentally creating something that wipes us out, a disease which comes about quite naturally and wipes us all out. Like, for example, if HIV had been airborne in its transmission, we would have all had it before we even heard of it, and we wouldn't be having this conference. Yes?
Giant impact of comets and so on have been known to wipe out species.
That's a good one. So this is the first or second, I guess, after what you mentioned here, the risk which is not our own fault. Although it is our own fault, we have the technology to get 100 years advance warning and we haven't deployed it, even though it might cost, $5 per American. Yeah?
So none of these problems are going to be an issue unless you get people to understand them and care. And so what keeps me up at night are the fact that people don't understand and they don't care.
Very good one.
Can I say something like relating?
Yeah, let's just finish the list and then talk about what can we do about them, which is I think what we'll spend most of the time on. Any final additions? Just ones that we have overlooked and that should come up and be raised. Yes.
Well, it's related to some that have come up, and it's just mistakes in synthetic biology. Because whereas it's expensive to develop a nuclear weapon, it could become very, very cheap to play around with synthetic biology.
Good. Anything else? We have to hope that Hans stop coming up soon. Just getting more and more risks here. Yes.
Giant solar flares.
Giant solar flares.
Unchecked greed.
Unchecked greed. Yeah. Good.
Wall Street kind of.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, there's a long-term clock on the biosphere due to the sun changing.
So in a million years, the oceans boil off. Yeah.
So boiling oceans could be an issue.
And because we know how to solve this now, thanks to you and others, but we need a lot of long-term planning to move to Earth's orbit, which is exactly what you made, and in vein of what you said. If it's a 300 million year engineering project, it's, yeah?
Low air quality over cities. We worry a lot about CO2 rising, but in some major cities, oxygen has dropped by almost 30%.
Good. Well, bad, rather, yeah.
I'll be more down to earth. Increasing or continuing social disparity, bringing political instability and leading to all the people.
Good. So this is another bad. And sorry, I keep saying good. Another thing which can increase the instability, just like low biodiversity can. Yes.
Related to that, tyranny, collectivism, and other such measures that take away our personal and group agency, which leads to a loss of human dignity, which was discussed yesterday.
Good. Good. I think we have plenty to worry about. What can we do about it? So was there someone else who wanted to make some introductory remarks who didn't get a chance yet? Otherwise, I would like to ask each of you on the panel, what do you think, what do you feel as a species are the best things we can do about it? And in particular, which is much more relevant, what can those of us in this room do to really make a difference? We just tried to make a difference at the beginning of the session by launching this essay contest. What else can we do? Yes?
2 of the 10 best biographies I've read in the last 5 years were about one person, Robert Oppenheimer. And what's kind of fascinating about Oppenheimer was he was a brilliant scientist who tried to get involved in society, and society ended up by destroying him. And I think we're living in a really interesting time, because if you think about it, every single elite that we have has suffered a major drop in reputation. Politicians in my own country, I don't know so much in America, but in my own country, the media has been shown to be corrupt and gullible. Business and finance is screwed up, and right now, adjacent to science, and particularly to physics, we see that the elite in Silicon Valley, the internet elite, have now been changed in the pocket of the government. So the one elite that so far has not crumbled is the scientific elite. But to refer back to this question about global warming, most scientists agree with climate change. They try to get the message over. What happens? It gets scrambled, and this highlights a problem. Scientists, it's pretty clear to identify what problems are. But then when you go down like Robert Oppenheimer and try and engage with the real world, something really awful happens. And if you look at climate change, whenever I remember vividly going to America in April 2009, just after the global financial crisis, and there was a conference in Washington full of entrepreneurs, venture capitalists. And basically the nature of the conference was, well, the US government's going to have to pump prime the economy, there's going to be lots of money handed out, how can we benefit from that as entrepreneurs? And as a European, as an English guy going out, I was actually, I thought I'd gone to a space-time warp because I had never come across such vitriol in terms of how people felt about their government. And this is the problem with climate change, because when you ask a number of people, when I read the American press the whole time, they make the link, climate change, there are all these scientists telling us it's bad, this is just another ruse for the government to raise taxes, and it's as basic as that. So it's very clear, it's easy to identify what the problem is, but you've got this kind of ambient paranoia amongst the population and the media that it always somehow equates to increased government control. And that's one of the big problems.
So what do you feel, or I would ask everybody in the panel, so I have a New Year's resolution that I made, which I will now confess to you, which is this year, 2014, I'm not allowed to complain to myself about anything unless I follow this mental complaining by also asking myself, thinking about it for a little bit, what can I personally actually do about this? So you raised a very interesting and important question. Is what can we here do in large or small way to do something about that? Or for that matter, any of the other things that were raised. But if you have some thoughts about what you mentioned now, that'd be great.
Well, I think one thing, we're living in a kind of golden age, I think, of scientific writing. And one of the problems is when one of the things you've got to guard about is how you convey information. If you look in the real world, information is what is surprising. It's what astounds you. It's new. Okay? And so what doesn't work is when you take the Bono route, Bono U2. I remember going to a concert in Dublin, and Bono stood up and told us, well, world poverty is terrible, we should all fight against it. And I thought, why do I need a rock star to tell me the obvious? There is nothing surprising in that. So my message is that scientists have to find a way, those who are able to communicate, because not all of them can, of finding an information-rich and also positive way of getting these messages out. Because if you just stand there and say, global warming is terrible, you have to cut down carbon emissions, blah, 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 blah. There's almost like no information that it's obvious. So you've got to find a way of communicating successfully that you engage with people.
Melanie, you had something you wanted to say?
So what I think the role for FQXi is in regard to existential risk and why it's important for us to be looking at it here is very similar to some of the grander themes of the conference, which is we've been able to make formalizations and distinctions about a number of conceptual topics that hadn't really been formalized in detail before. So namely, some of the distinctions between predictability and free will, and determinism, distinctions between consciousness and intelligence. And these are the kind of, the role for FQXi is continuing this capability of formalizing, thinking about information and probability and risk as a first step in becoming more specific about existential risk as a topic and specific kinds of existential risks. And then since it is inherently a probability risk management problem, handing it off to some sort of systematic, stratified risk management website or resource where risks are enumerated and evaluated, quantified, updated, and with countermeasures proposed and put in place as policy initiatives after that. But the formalization is why FQXi is looking at existential risk is a valuable part to me.
Thank you. Jan?
So Max's question was, of course, was a complete softball for me. Because like not only have I thought about what to do about these things, but I've been doing them over the last few years. And I actually things are moving in the right direction because there are several developments that have happened since the last conference, really. So as I mentioned, one is the establishment of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk, which we are still in the funding, we are still funding constrained, and we haven't done much. However, we have done one big thing, which is we have given a canonical answer to anybody who is faced with a question like existential risks, says who, and you can just point them to the website, and there's a list of very prominent people who say that. Second thing is that existential risks have this problem of tragedy of commons. There is no way to profit from addressing existential risks, at least, or gain a comparative advantage in terms of money. However, there's a movement that is really getting traction. It's called effective altruism, and if you look it up, there are several organizations that are basically kind of banding together under this topic. It's people who have realized that it's important not just to be altruistic and give, but also make sure that your giving actually achieves an impact. And once people really start thinking about what it means to have an impact, they quickly kind of home in on, okay, existential risks completely dominate what effective altruists should think about. So this is I'm hopeful that there will be an inflow of funds from this. And actually, interestingly, MetaMed, that my business partner here, Michael, mentioned earlier, it's a bit complicated story how MetaMed factors into it. So let me just kind of half jokingly say that it's important to create a medical organization that is concerned about people's health and that can do serious research, because existential risks are bad for your health.
So when I hear what can we do as a species about existential risk, I sort of feel that question is a major contributor to existential risk, because it implies that we as a species is a coherent agent that can make deliberative decisions.
I mean, it's that ask, what can we in this room do?
Yes, that's a much better question. I'm not complaining about Max's overall thing, but I feel that the we as a species idea is in our heads, the we as a species liking a long-term plan. The thing is, evolution learns only by trial and error. Collectives that don't have information flows that feed back on themselves and examine themselves can't actually learn and plan. And most human behaviors don't look like they are learning integrated organizational information organizing behaviors. When I look at the world of human behaviors, one really sticks out, and that's science, especially theoretical science, which manages to integrate and organize information without a tremendous amount of feedback from the outside world, and hopefully not drift off into total fantasy. So I think it's probably a good idea, if we're going to survive, to learn to place our locus of identity entirely and exclusively in some sort of an organization that can provide feedback. Because otherwise, if I try to be a Bayesian updater, and I consider myself to be part of a collective, and the collective thinks one thing, and I think a different thing, then I can tell the collective something, and I'm moved, my beliefs are moved by its beliefs, and its beliefs may or may not be moved by mine. But if its beliefs are not moved by mine, then I keep on updating my beliefs towards its beliefs. And I essentially am not an intelligent system, and I can't contribute. So basically, as long as people never change their mind at even the tiniest bit because they disagree with something that doesn't change its mind even the tiniest bit because it disagrees with them, they can be part of a collectively intelligent process that can reflect and solve problems. And since very few things in the world are processes like that, I've been trying to build them. MetaMed is the primary example, but I'm actually happy to contribute my efforts to essentially any collective intelligent enterprise which has that key property, that it should never ask anyone to change its mind at all, without change their mind at all, without changing its mind at least somewhat.
Thank you. And I think that's also a beautiful way of articulating one of the core goals we have for the Foundational Questions Institute, that we should listen to other people's ideas and always be prepared to question everything, including our own beliefs. I just want to add, if this idea that scientists like us should think about existential risk, if it sounds weird that we should be having this session, it's actually part of a very fine tradition. Of course, the physicists, we physicists feel a little bit extra guilty about existential risks, since we wouldn't be having the nuclear threat if it weren't for us. And we don't have, and if you removed all scientists, we wouldn't have hardly any of the existential risks that were brought up here earlier. So there's been a lot of sense for a long time that scientists, by bringing these risks into the world and by arguably understanding them as well as anyone, also have a very special responsibility. And as you know, in response to that, there have been a number of organizations founded, like the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Federation of American Scientists, and others overseas, who took as their mission to try to inform society better. And I think, on an optimistic note, I think even though we're still in a pretty terrible situation in the sense that we have these very large, poorly mitigated risks, these organizations, I think, have clearly had a positive impact. It would be even worse otherwise. Even Hugh Everett, does anyone know what he did after he couldn't get a job in physics, after he invented many worlds? Yeah, he went and worked for the Pentagon and developed fallout models for nuclear war. And it could be argued that he was the first person to really make the military establishment realize the full horror of nuclear winter, which might have made people a bit less trigger happy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, who knows? So we should certainly not feel powerless as scientists to have an impact in the right direction. I see a lot of hands, so feel free now to ask questions to the panel and make brief remarks. I'll want to ask people first who haven't yet had a chance. Larissa?
I wanted to ask the panel and also the people here, maybe we can make a vote or something, because scientists usually tend to just put out the data and let people interpret. How many people think that scientists should actually step up more and actually interpret their findings for the benefit of the society?
Let's do a show of hands. How many people think that? Raise your hands. How many people think we should not? Raise your hands. Okay, you get the honor of, since as Michael said, we should always be prepared as a collective to change our mind. Tell us why. No. Why or why not, rather. Yeah. Brendan is on his way.
Actually, what I really wanted to say is this. Imagine the following science fiction scenario. Let's go back 100 years. It's 1914. Tsar Nicholas I, the leader of a very powerful country, decides to think into the future and hold an international conference on planning for another 100 years. And you would laugh at this idea, obviously, because that was before air travel, before internet, before nuclear bomb, before Mao, before whatever, before even the revolution which killed the Tsar and his family. How can you plan 10,000 years ago? I say thanks God we are only planning for the horizon of our children and grandchildren and not 10,000 years ahead. That's my point.
Someone on the panel want to say something about that? Why should we even bother planning when it's so hard?
Yeah, despite the potential inaccuracies of reality compared to planning, planning is still quite useful as an exercise.
Well, I think, the first step is just to know what you're planning for, right? What you want to happen. And it may be difficult to do that, to plan to get there, but we don't even know what we want to happen. So, I think that is a fundamental problem, because you certainly won't get where you want to go if you don't know where it is.
Which is exactly the topic of the essay contest.
I
What is
clearly
that?
know what it's. I want
What
my
is
children
that?
and my grandchildren to thrive.
That's good, and that's a short-term goal.
Just add a more optimistic note there on the value of planning. Even if we don't know exactly what we want to do, I think I'm not even going to bother doing a show of hands. I suspect we have a strong majority here who thinks at least a good first step would be to still be around as in 10 years or 100 years, so that there's something to plan for rather than go extinct. And yet, there are more people who know who Michael Jackson was than who know who Vasily Arkhipov was. Even though Michael Jackson was not the guy who single-handedly stopped the Soviet nuclear attack during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So even if you set the bar really low and say, okay, let's just at least try to spread important knowledge about things like this, about what the risks are and what we can do about them, with kind of minimal efforts, we should be able to do vastly better than we are doing now. Michael?
When I imagine attempting for real to plan for 10,000 years, it does involve trying to figure out what we want, but more so it involves trying to figure out how to think about what we want at the right level of abstraction without our cognitive processes individually and collectively breaking down into nonsense. How to develop rules of philosophy that we can adhere to that don't rule out important leaps of thought that will have to be made someday, the way, for instance, Euclidean geometry ruled out important leaps of thought, but which include, but which keep a process of deliberation that's not necessarily tightly grounded in everyday experience from going off the rails. And I can't actually see any way that you could make a plan that extended beyond a set of people who were genuinely and visibly engaged in that plan. So it seems to me that any sort of real long-term goal would have to be a goal for a group of people that could actually convey and share an epistemology. And so it might be a good idea, if you had a long-term goal, to draw a clean firewall between the epistemic center and not convey your scientific findings, not convey any findings that might be disruptive and might increase the rate of change of any sort. Like, I can imagine, it's sort of a wild, crazy speculation, but I think back to ancient Greece and Greek science, and they seem to be going really well for a while. And then Aristotle, who everyone thought was the greatest mind ever, came and ruined everything. And I've always wondered, wait a moment, did Aristotle do that by accident? Or did he see that that was the obviously correct move? In terms of long-term planning, you had this global society. If you were going to make it figure out anything, you would almost certainly want to ruin science and keep any sort of functional deliberative process behind a firewall so that the outside world changed slowly enough that you can keep up. Now, I doubt that that's what he was thinking, but honestly, who knows? It does seem like the inevitable consequence of thinking about thinking and thinking about people not thinking very well.
All right, that's a very provocative thought, although even if it worked in ancient Greece, obviously it wouldn't work now when there's so much science being done independently in many different countries and in many different companies. So
I'm kind of unconvinced of that. I think that high quality epistemology is actually restricted to, at best, a few tens of thousands of people.
I thought this meant that if we stop ever telling anybody what we discover, we're going to also prevent scientists in North Korea from
I don't think there are real scientists in North Korea that can actually do anything on their own.
Or people in the finance sector.
I don't think there are real scientists in finance who can develop AI either. I actually think if you get to know the smartest people or the best thinkers in places like finance, you'll find that the smartest people might be kind of comparably smart to the smart people here, but they're incredibly bad at abstract thought. Their epistemology is monstrously sloppy. Like the Chinese Mandarinate must have had more people with higher IQs than Aristotle, then ancient Athens had people. But the Chinese Mandarinate, throughout its millennia, accomplished less significant thought than just Aristotle.
All right. Then I want to make sure we have a lot of, give the opportunity to a lot of other people to ask questions. You, Seth, have had your hand up for a long
I just
time.
want to make a comment. I really appreciate that point because many people here may know this, but do you know that around 350 BC, Aristarchus of Samos proposed a model for the solar system. It was heliocentric. The Earth rotated around the sun, rotating around its own axis as it went. And this got quashed because Aristotle, who knew something, but not much, about fluid mechanics and centrifugal force, said, well, that can't be true. There would be great winds, people would fall off. And then Ptolemy said, oh, we got to go with Aristotle on this.
Okay, we want to make sure we spend enough time with the president also, but you look so unhappy, Carlo. I'll give you 20 seconds to talk about Aristotle. Okay, Alex then. Alex, thank you.
Well, this may be a utopian remark, but given the number of existential threats, I think it's highly likely that they're going to screw up at some point. And I think one project that may address most of the existential threats is colonizing the galaxy, or at least colonizing something, and moving beyond the Earth. And that, of course, will take resources of the entire civilization, but it will take a lot of work to take this project off the ground. But I think without it, we are pretty close to being doomed.
So that's very much in the spirit of what you were saying, Kurt, right? That's certainly a project that requires long-term planning.
Yeah, that requires real long-term planning. It requires, I think, AI as well, because it won't be our biological forms that do the colonization.
Yeah, feel free to bring up other things. Remember, the basic theme of our discussion is what can we here in this room actually do to make a positive difference?
Coming back to the present a little bit, I think that there is something historically very important that is happening right now, which is, I think this is for the first time in our collective history, we actually have a concern, which is a global concern towards salvation. I don't think this has ever happened before. There is, through the integration of society and networks and internet, etc., there is sort of a growing consensus that we can think as a species towards the survival of our planet and our cultural, legacy. And that's new, and I think the questions you're asking are perfectly relevant. I mean, if you look at the list that people made of threats, they're all relevant, they're all spin-offs of science, right? It's AI going crazy, it's nuclear, bombs, it's biological, machines going crazy. So these are all scientific spin-offs. So here we are, right, at this moment, having the consciousness in which we are asking this question, what can we do to save us? And at the same time, it is our responsibility to make sure that we don't screw up. So that's just a point.
Max, I want to say one other thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we talk about these existential risks and long-term planning, we talk about sort of propagating rational thought, and that might be the way to get people to work on these goals. And I suggest that might not be totally sufficient. For example, we just saw this new Pew report on evolution. Shows that 50% of Republicans don't believe in evolution today. It's 200 years or 150 years after Darwin, and it was well documented at that time.
Yeah, in fact, 42% of all Americans, not just of any political party, believe that our Earth is less than 10,000 years old.
And so they had all categories. But my point is that something beyond just propagation of rational thought might be needed, and religions have been very good at doing that in the past. So maybe we just need a new religion.
But I think, though, it's important to differentiate between what people believe and what they say that they believe. So like abstract beliefs have been known to just be kind of banners for declaring loyalty, not necessarily. So my prediction would be if you actually put people who say that they don't believe in evolution and put them in life-threatening situation where the answer determines whether they live or not, and ask them the same question. I don't know how to engineer that. They would actually quickly have one correct answer.
My prediction would be that 99.9% of people, creationists and evolutionists alike, if you put them in such a situation, would die because the evolutionists are also just waving beliefs as a banner of loyalty, and only some absolutely trivial number of people believe in the theory of evolution.
Okay. We have an experiment.
Way in the back.
About Bono, and I wondered if there might be any, why do you need to hear things from a musician? But maybe with scientists, there's such brain power in this room, it's so inspiring and amazing. And maybe an option would be to collaborate with these pop culture icons who do actually reach the general public, rather than working in a silo where the general culture doesn't have any access to this incredible insight that all of you have here.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Do you want to comment on that?
There's one danger here that fits in with what some of you said, which is that the problem with the general population is that when a scientist says something and makes a prediction, they think, okay, so that's going to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, or the scientist changes his mind, and the scientists as a collective change their mind, then there's this danger that the collective populace think, okay, so they're not as brainy as we thought, because the normal population doesn't realize that science and the discovery of truth is kind of continuous. It's a process. You keep peeling away, you keep refining. So the danger is, what I was trying to say was, and I don't know the solution, but the danger is once scientists step into the public arena, they are then going to be judged like politicians and other people, which is that the mass population seems to only be able to conceive in terms of absolute truth. They don't really understand probabilities. That's my concern.
So but this is a very interesting point that you make there, right? Because these scientists could be accused of, in many cases, being very arrogant and saying, oh, somehow we think we're so much cleverer, blah, blah, and the rest of the world, they should pay attention to what we say in our boring faculty meetings and at our secluded conferences or read our boring technical papers, rather than really ask ourselves, okay, what is actually effective? I mean, you talked about evaluating effectiveness, and we know that anything Bono says is going to be, whatever the message is, it's going to be heard a lot more than when we say it. So I'm curious to hear if there are any dissenters here to the view that, or any creative thoughts basically along these lines of things we can actually do. Yeah.
Maybe there could be an opportunity to, educate the general public about probabilities and the importance of understanding statistics, and not just assume that everyone's stupid or not able to comprehend anything, and assuming that it's the lowest common denominator. It's just a thought.
I guess I don't assume that things are the lowest common denominator. I have, however, read lots of studies, and I know that if you ask people, given a room consisting of rectangles and a cost per square foot of carpet and a calculator, ask them what the cost of carpeting the room is, 3% of the population can answer that correctly.
But again,
Well, there are lots of different forms of intelligence.
Before we
we're
may have a
talking
bit
about
of
the forms required to evaluate global warming.
But before we throw any stones in glass houses here, I mean, can anyone here honestly say that they haven't been slightly irrational at some point in their life? I mean, I think the point. Wait. I think the question you raised is one about pragmatism. What can we do in practice that really helps? And I think that I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance, because there's some people on the right side who haven't had a chance to say much. Your turn. Yeah. No, you.
So I wanted to comment about, I very much liked what you were saying before, and I wanted to connect when you said that maybe we need a new religion. And knowledge is always power, and we may have the temptation to behave like gurus. And this is exactly the way in which we will fail, because we have to go exactly in the opposite direction and empower people with knowledge. As there was a slogan from Giulio Tononi yesterday that may be true for single individuals, but it's even more nice for society. That was the more an individual determines itself, knows itself, the more it's free. So the same is for society. The more we empower society with knowledge, the more the society will be free. And I think that there is a strong link between the ability of critical thinking that we use in science and the ability of critical thinking that is needed for a democratic society.
So I agree with everything you said, and I think you need to push all the buttons and propagate all the rational thinking that you can. But you also need health provision. You know, if the Catholic Church would just get behind the idea that we don't want global warming, there would be enormously more effort put on that. And they haven't. You know, none of the major religions have gotten behind that particular
Can I ask
concept.
Max a question? Because having read your book, I see that your first degree course was meant to be economics. What I wanted to ask you was, so what turned you off of physics as a school kid?
Oh, it was my most boring subject in high school. I just couldn't see how anyone could ever in their right mind find this fun. And my first lecture ever, the guy comes in and says, "Today we're going to talk about density.
So
density is the mass divided by the volume."
So this is my point, because this is my point. It relates back to the last question. There's a guy here, it's Spiros. Are you in here? Can you put your hand up? No, he's not here. One of the most interesting things I've heard since I've been here is the old chap at Caltech who's working with Google. And he's found a way to teach school kids the basics of quantum physics. And I thought this is a great idea, because if you can inculcate in people ideas about probability that make it interesting, because you teach kids classical physics, and then when they grow up, you realize that most of it doesn't apply. So I think, coming back to education and finding an imaginative and exciting way to give people even just a small hint of what the scientific process is, so that they don't get locked into dogmas. That's the key. If you can teach a way of people to distrust dogma.
This, just to synthesize a little bit as a chair here, quite a large number of the recent comments and questions have centered around the importance of education, which I think is very uncontroversial and something we can all agree on. I think it's, for example, another Pew poll that another poll that was done recently showed that only about 10% of the people in the Helmand province in southern Afghanistan had heard of the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah.
And that's clearly not because people there are really dumb and have really low IQs. It's not that you don't have the ability to get this knowledge, but also most of them can't read, and if you're a woman, you normally can't even go to school, and it seems pretty clear that in many situations like this, where people maybe give in to dogma, right, they would maybe have been less prone to go with dogma if they had been given an education. You highlighted here the importance of more advanced education and getting people to understand quantum mechanics and get inspired rather than burned out. But things like this also point to the importance of just very basic education, and there's a lot of people who still never even get taught to read.
I was just thinking that Native Americans talk about the seventh generation, about 120 years in the future, and that's something they've been able to handle for thousands of years, and something we could handle. And I think wisdom is what's needed. We have a lot of smart people, and a lot of smart people in Congress. I've met many of them, but wisdom is the principal thing. So I just think long-term thinking and wisdom is what's required, and we have to know how to recognize that. I would just point out that the respect Native Americans have for nature is similar to what scientists are trained in, because scientists are trained that nature is the arbiter. And scientists as a whole would not ignore, for example, global warming or bees becoming, I won't go into that, I'll stay on the high point. That, for example, seeds are being stored in Norway for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that is indeed.
These kind of efforts.
Thank you for that high note before we go into the coffee breaks. Just to summarize everything I've heard here as a moderator, then I guess I could say that on one hand, we sure have a lot to worry about. You were very effective in articulating a long list of things that we can lie awake at night worrying about, and we also should lie awake sometimes worrying about. On the other hand, many of you, and especially many of you here at the end, have also articulated another idea, which I find very empowering, which is that we humans actually have enormous potential for doing things about this to the better. And when I say we, I'm not using we anymore as in our species, which you correctly criticized me for doing, Mike, but I even mean we here in this room. So let's go ahead and stretch our legs a little bit and think about how we can all make a difference. Thank you. Let's go now.